time.
Game face. Are we back on? Okay. Apologies for that. Once again, we are trying to suss out what this issue is, and we are at a sticking point. The Dark Ages. I blame Satan and the priest who can't marry. So
That's the problem.
Yeah, we'll pick back up where we left off. And Tim, if I can channel my mind back to the conversation, we were at the point where you were talking about.
They didn't really sort of reject ancient Greek science. They were quite happy with ancient Greek science.
Perfect.
And they were quite happy to adopt it. And therefore they kind of preserved it. So people often say to me, well, no, they didn't preserve it, it was the Arabs, right? And I often say to them, where do you think the Arabs got those ancient Greek works from? Do you think they fell from the sky? You know, did they find them in a cave? No, they were given to them, they were passed to them by Christian scribes, mainly Nestorian Christians who preserved them in translation in Syriac, and also people who preserved them in the original Greek. So this idea that they destroyed the ancient knowledge of the ancient world is completely wrong, which makes a lot of people wonder, well, okay, how did so much of it get lost? And the answer to that is that's what happens when your civilization collapses. So remember what I was saying, when the Roman Empire fell apart in the West, it actually went like pretty chaotic for quite a while. For about the first sort of 2 or 3 centuries, we had a genuine dark age. And this is why I say, yes, there was a dark age. It was in that period from about the 5th century up to about the 8th century. So kind of before the period you guys were talking about before. But in that period, things were really chaotic. What used to be the Roman Empire had fragmented. All long-distance trade broke down. The economy collapsed. Large-scale buildings and so on, which had been sustained by the enormous amount of money that the Roman Empire had been able to bring in, were no longer done. Therefore, the technology associated with that was forgotten. And a lot of the stuff that the Romans had been able to do was simply lost. It was completely forgotten. People wonder, how can that happen? I've had people say to me, well, the Romans used to use concrete, and then they completely forgot how to make concrete. How do you forget how to make concrete? The answer is, if you don't make concrete for 2 or 3 generations and no one's written it down, how to make concrete, and most people can't fucking read anyway, you forget how to make concrete. If our civilization collapsed, we might kind of know about atomic theory, vaguely, but would we be able to build a nuclear power station? I think so. We'd have to learn it again from scratch. Steve would. Okay.
Yeah, I might remember something, but probably not.
So this is what happened, and as a result, a hell of a lot of this learning was lost. Again, we find it very strange to kind of think of whole books being lost, but when a copy of any given book has to be written out by hand, and when there are maybe a few hundred, maybe at most a few thousand copies of any given text, it's actually incredibly easy for all copies of a book to be lost. So we've probably got about 1/10 or less of the works that existed in the ancient world. And we're lucky to even have that. Sometimes people sort of say, well, yeah, they did preserve some of them, but they didn't work very hard to preserve all of it, and that's why the stuff was lost. They didn't preserve the stuff that they didn't agree with, for example. Well, that's not quite true. For example, Aristotle said that the universe was eternal and didn't have a beginning in time. That completely contradicts the Bible, yet they preserved that. So they were quite happy to preserve these works that had ideas in them that they didn't agree with, because they had other stuff in them that they found useful. So why did so much get lost? In the West, most of the stuff that was lost was stuff written in Greek. And that's because even before the fall of the Roman Empire, literacy in Greek had been declining. This is complicated, but quickly, in around about that 3rd century period, when the Roman Empire nearly fell apart, things kind of got back together towards the end and stabilized in the 4th century, but some stuff never actually recovered. one of the things that never recovered was education. So the kind of education that the ruling elite used to have, which was very much about learning Greek and reading Homer and reading maybe technical scientific works, that kind of education declined or disappeared. And the new education was very much about running and administering the empire, and was very much focused on the military. And as a result, works in Greek became fewer and fewer and fewer because there were fewer and fewer people reading them. And that meant that when the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, effectively most of that stuff was completely gone. So what then happened was they had to try and get it back again. And the idea that the medieval period lasted until the wonderful Renaissance is built on this idea that that was when they rediscovered ancient Greek and Roman learning. And that's true, but the Greek and Roman learning they discovered in the Renaissance wasn't science, mathematics, and philosophy. It was largely poems, plays, and some bits and pieces on architecture, and a bit of the scientific stuff. The period where they actually went and rediscovered the scientific stuff was in the Middle Ages. It was in what we call the 12th century revival, or the 12th century Renaissance. What was happening then was Europe had emerged from that early medieval period of chaos and was starting to stabilise. It was also starting to get much richer, and basically people were starting to get time to sit and think, you know what, we used to have these books. I've got references to these books in my other books. Where are they? And so there was a guy called Gerard of Cremona who wanted to read a book by Ptolemy. This is a book on astronomy, and he couldn't find a copy. He lived in Italy. So he went to Paris and he said, have you guys got a copy? And they said, no, but they might have one in Spain. A bit like going from bookshop to bookshop, except he's crossing the continent. So he then went to Spain, and they said, no, we don't have a copy, but the Muslims who live south of us, they've got this great big centre of learning in Cordoba. Go there. So he went there, taught himself Arabic, and then began to translate not just this book by Ptolemy, but a whole lot of others into Latin. These were Greek and Roman works that had been lost in the West, but had been preserved in the East, translated into Arabic, and now found their way back into Western Europe via translations from the Arabic. He translated 87 books, and they were all on science, mathematics, and philosophy. So was there a revival of ancient Greek and Roman learning? Yes, in the Middle Ages. And the stuff that they were interested in was actually what we would consider to be the cool stuff, science and philosophy. So this idea that, and these guys were all churchmen, by the way. So this idea that the church hated this stuff and suppressed it, again, complete bullshit. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So the interesting thing here is that, I just mentioned science, and I keep using that as a shorthand. You might remember last time I was talking about how prior to about the 16th century, what we can't really call it science because it wasn't science in the modern sense. It was, so I usually kind of refer to it as either natural philosophy or I sometimes call it proto-science. But the idea that there was no science in the Middle Ages and the church suppressed science is, again, completely wrong. What was going on in the 12th century was really the beginnings of and the laying the foundations of the genuine expansion of science in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the idea that the church was hostile to natural philosophy is again, another myth. There was a guy around about the same time as Gerard of Cremona, a guy called William of Conches. He was in France. He was based in Chartres, where there's, if anyone's ever been to France, if you get a chance to go to Chartres Cathedral, one of the most beautiful places on earth. And he worked there in the great school of Chartres. And this guy was very much a rationalist. I'll read you a quote from him. It's from the 12th century, beginning of the 12th century. He says, "Some people say to me, we don't know how this is, but we know that God can do it." Right? This is the creationist argument. God did it. The God of the gaps. We don't know how this works, but basically God can do it. And his response is, "You fools, God can make a cow out of a tree if he wanted to, but has he ever done so? Therefore, show some reason why a thing is so, or cease to hold that it is so." In other words, come up with a rational reason for stuff happening, or fuck off. And
I like it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is in the middle of the Middle Ages. William of Conches wrote a book where he was interpreting Genesis. Ken Ham would hate this guy. And he said, if you interpret this literally, you're a fucking idiot. Because look, 1 minute he's talking about how God created day, and then the next day he's creating the sun. How can he create day and then create the sun? This isn't a literal book.
Because faith, Tim, faith.
That's right. Well, William of Conches said, what we need to do is we need to look at the truth that underlies this. And so he took the bit in Genesis where it talks about God creating Adam out of dust. And he says, well, that doesn't make sense. How can you make a man out of dust? Even if you're God, if God just wanted to create a man like that, he wouldn't need to make it out of dust. So why is the Bible saying that God created man out of dust? He then talked about how simple things, the elements, can act together to make more complex structures, and then lesser creatures could develop into more complex creatures, and eventually man could develop out of that. Sound familiar?
A wee bit.
Well,
Evolution.
I mean, the nebula hypothesis is that the Earth was created by accretion of dust, and we came from there. So therefore, maybe the Bible was right.
Yep, there you go. But I think that
Checkmate atheists.
Checkmate atheists. So I think the thing is here's a guy in the 12th century in the so-called Dark Ages who's effectively talking about evolution. A couple of centuries later, there was a guy called Robert Grosseteste, came up with an idea about how the universe came into being through an expansion of an explosion of light that expanded outwards and then cooled, and how the planets formed for the coalescing of the dust from this expansion. That was in the 13th century. Right, so this is the period where supposedly the church was suppressing science. Whenever people talk about the church suppressing science in the Middle Ages, I always say, I've been saying this for 30 years, give me one example, just one, of anyone in the Middle Ages who was burnt at the stake, imprisoned, tortured, or spoken to harshly by the church for anything to do with the rational analysis of the physical world. I've been challenging people to do that for over 30 years. No one has been able to give me a single example because it never happened. So again, what's going on here? The idea that the church was suppressing science is, again, a post-medieval idea being projected back onto the Middle Ages. People are thinking about what was going on around about the time of Galileo, where there definitely was a clash between the rise of science, true science, and some political and theological issues. And then they assume that there must have been the case beforehand. It simply wasn't. In the medieval period, the church's attitude to this stuff was, it's all for the greater glory of God. If you can discover new things about the world, go do it. Good stuff. That's a really quick summary of science in the Middle Ages. There's some great books on this. And there's a great book by a fellow called Edward Grant called The Medieval Foundations of Modern Science, which basically trace how the modern scientific revolution actually arose out of this stuff in the medieval period. So that one's definitely worth checking out. There's another book by a friend of mine called John Hannam. He's a nice guy. He's a Catholic, but he's a nice guy despite that. But he's got more to the point. He's got a doctorate in history of science and a bachelor's from Oxford in physics, and he wrote a book called God's Philosophers, which is basically a history of science in the medieval period. That's a good introductory book on this one as well. Any questions on medieval science?
Somewhere. Steve, wasn't there somebody else was talking about at one point that book, God's Philosophers?
If it is, I don't recognize it.
It sounds familiar.
It was. It got nominated for the Royal Society's prize for science writing a few years ago. So it's an excellent book.
Fancy, awesome. I'll put that in the description.
Yeah,
I'm looking at it. It doesn't look familiar. James Hannam.
That's the name.
Yeah, it doesn't look familiar.
So that's sort of the scientific stuff. I think that's kind of related to the idea that the church suppressed technology. So if you think back to our friend Jim West's very scientific chart, the idea was that there was no technical innovation in the medieval period. And certainly in that true dark age, the collapse period after the fall of the Roman Empire, technology did go backwards. So we talked about how if you don't build an aqueduct for a couple of hundred years, people forget how to build aqueducts. And that definitely did happen. Also, if your economy fragments, so effectively you are reduced to subsistence level farming, your technology levels will quite often shrink as well. And that certainly did happen in that kind of Mad Max period in the first few hundred years after the fall. But in a funny sort of a way, that also drove technological change, because the Roman Empire had always had a massive labour surplus. They had literally millions of slaves. And you might recall I was talking about, last time I was talking about the guy who invented a machine to drag large pillars, and the Emperor Vespasian paid him not to build it because he said, what would the slaves do?
Brilliant.
Yeah. So the Romans had a problem that they had too many people to do the work. In the medieval period, particularly in that early medieval period, their problem was exactly the opposite. So they had there was a massive decline in population around about the time of the collapse of the empire. There was a huge epidemic of bubonic plague in the 6th century. It was what's called the Justinian plague. And that massively reduced the population in Western Europe. So you had the economy collapse. People were living on subsistence level farms, and they had a labour shortage. So what do to try to help yourself survive? You find ways to save labour. So they started building machines. And one of the main machines that they really implemented and propagated across Europe was the watermill. The Romans had watermills. The Romans had very sophisticated watermills. They had overshot watermills. There's a place called Barbigel in Spain where we've excavated an entire factory where there was something like 15 watermills down a cascade, and it was churning out industrial levels of grain, churning it out as flour. But on the whole, the Romans didn't harness mechanical technology like watermills on a huge scale. Partly because they had so many slaves, partly because also the Roman Empire was centred on the Mediterranean basin, and water streams there tend to only flow fairly intermittently, particularly only in winter. Whereas in Northern Europe, it rains a lot. Anyone's ever been to England, you'll know that. So you get constant flow in most of the rivers. So what they started to do is they started to harness water-powered technology. And they didn't just harness it a little bit, they harnessed it a lot. They weren't just using it for grinding grain, they were using it for all kinds of other things, for fulling cloth, for pumping bellows, for trip hammers, for making paper. So there was a whole range of things that they were using this stuff for. And what it meant was that it was freeing up labour so that they could then go off and do other stuff. Just to give you an idea of how much they harnessed water power, in Roman Britain, there was possibly a few hundred watermills, maybe. We don't know. But we estimate that it would be less than 1,000. In Anglo-Saxon England, at around about 1066 or just after William the Conqueror conquered England and decided he wanted to do a bit of a survey called the Domesday Book of what he had conquered. So we've got good documentation on this. There were 5,624 watermills, large enough to be included in that survey. So that's one for every 50 households for a population of around about 1,400,000 people. So in other words, they were harnessing mechanical power for the first time on a massive scale. And that was in the 11th century, it increased greatly. So this means that they were looking at machines and thinking, here's something that we could mechanize, let's try this. They also used other technologies that the Romans hadn't used. The Romans' plows were fairly simple because soil in the Mediterranean basin is fairly dry and loose, and so you don't need a highly sophisticated plow. Unfortunately, those plows didn't work very well in Northern Europe, where the soils are heavy and quite often quite waterlogged. And that was why the West, remember I was talking before about the Western Roman Empire being the poor relation. That was because there was a whole lot of land up there that the Romans didn't farm because it wasn't able to be farmed using their technology, or not very effectively. Early medieval period, they worked out how to use what we call mould-board ploughs, which are ploughs that cut the sod and turn it. There's a kind of a board at an angle that turns the sod over. Sounds simple to us, but it revolutionised agriculture. And as a result, all of those territories that the Romans didn't farm very extensively became massively productive. And you ended up from around about the 10th century right through to the end of the medieval period going through what they call the long medieval economic boom. Medieval Europe in the second half of the medieval period was an absolute powerhouse. And this is why Europe went on to expand in the early modern period to places like America, to colonies in the East, and eventually to places like Australia. That's why that expansion came from Europe, not somewhere else, because medieval people worked out how to make Europe the most productive place on the planet, which it remains almost up to today. So again, was the medieval period backward? Depends on when you're talking about. In the period directly after the fall of the Roman Empire, absolutely. In the period from about the 11th century onwards, no, it was an expansive and extremely rich part of the world that went on to basically dominate the entire planet. Make sense?
Yeah, you talked about when you're talking about technology now. You touched on those different points that they would like the mills and things, but I noticed that you mysteriously left out the ancient technology of Wi-Fi obelisks that they had in Egypt.
Yeah, so I could see this coming, Kyle. I'm starting to get to see the warning signs when you start to get this slight smile. Yeah, I skipped over that because the Illuminati paid me to.
It was 802.11b, I think, or G. I'm not sure. It was 2.4 megahertz, I think, that they had.
That is exactly right.
That's pretty good.
Gigahertz. I'm sorry, gigahertz.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good, actually.
But I suppose keeping in mind the fact we're really sort of talking about these myths about the church suppressing technology, there's one example that I can think of where the church did suppress technology, or at least tried to. One weapon that was developed and increased in its power and therefore increased in its widespread use in the medieval period was the crossbow. The Romans did have crossbows, but the medieval ones got more and more powerful because they were using steel prods, that's the bow part at the front, and they were using winches to wind them back, whereas the Roman ones were hand-drawn. So a medieval crossbow could really pack a punch. Damn. And the church tried to ban the use of crossbows against Christians. So they passed a law saying you can only use them against Muslims or other infidels or heretics. You can't use them against Christians.
Hey, let me guess. The reason that law did not stand was because the people invoked their Second Amendment right to bear arms, and that's what, right?
No, it's just that crossbows are highly effective, and if you want to kill the bastard over the hill, then you go and use a crossbow. Once again, the church was completely ignored. This idea that the church had this sort of iron control is just total bullshit. But the interesting thing is the church was responsible for spreading a lot of that water power technology that I was talking about before. Because they were at the forefront of moving out into these wilderness areas of Europe and settling them. We think of Europe as being this very crowded place today, but as recently as 500 years ago, there were large areas of Europe that were uninhabited. And there was a group of Christians who were literally finding places that hadn't been settled and colonizing them. And that was the monastic houses. So the various monasteries were founding new houses and basically going out and finding what they call wilderness to try and get away from the world, because they wanted to go off somewhere where they could simply pray and tend their crops and their flocks and be holy, in theory.
Not so fast.
Not so fast. The problem with that, though, is that once they settled an area, then, of course, everything that comes with settlement followed them. So towns sprung up and so on. But in order to be able to sustain themselves in these newly colonized areas, they brought this new technology with them. And so they really harnessed a lot of these new machines, particularly the water power and later on the wind power. They invented more effective windmills. And so when we get a description in the 12th century of the refounding of the monastery, the Cistercian monastery of Clairvaux, there's a description by this monk called Arnold who was writing this description, and instead of writing about what a beautiful church it had or the carvings on the cloister, what he wrote about was its technology. He just wrote this absolute sort of lyrical description of the machines. And he talked about how at the north of the monastery there was a dam, there were canals that channeled the water through the monastery walls. It then flowed through a series of mills. It flowed through the bathhouses. It then flowed through various other factories and so on in the monastery, and then it flowed through the wash house, the lavatory, and then the latrine. So they had flushing toilets as well. Again, not exactly people's image of the Middle Ages. This was the layout of a Cistercian monastery. It was pretty typical. In fact, it's even said that a blind Cistercian monk from Scotland could go to a Cistercian monastery in Spain, thousands of kilometres away, and find his way around by touch because they used the same layout everywhere. And these guys were at the forefront of metals technology. They used blast furnaces. They used water-powered, assisted blast furnaces, trip hammers. All of this stuff was going on in the monasteries. And then, of course, it spread from the monasteries out into the rest of medieval society. So these guys were very keen on harnessing machines. Speaking of which, flying machines. If I were to say to you, who was the earliest person to come up with the idea of a flying machine, what name would you give me?
Da Vinci.
I knew you'd say that. Have you ever heard of Elmer of Malmesbury?
No, but I'm sure he was a fraud that stole it from Da Vinci.
Is that the guy that did the owl? No.
No.
Elmer, flying owl.
He couldn't. I don't think he did an owl. He couldn't have stolen it from Da Vinci because he lived in the 11th century. So he lived several hundred years before Da Vinci was born.
Fake news. News.
Elmer of Malmesbury was a monk at the great abbey, Benedictine Abbey of Malmesbury in England in the 11th century. He's one of the few people we know of who saw Halley's Comet twice in his lifetime. He saw it once when he was very young, and again in the year 1066 when the year he died. He was interested in astronomy. He wrote books on astronomy and meteorology, and he was also fascinated by flight. And he was watching the swallows flying off the roof of the church in the monastery and thought, I think I could build a machine that could do that. So he built something, we think it was probably a glider, dragged it to the top of the monastery church, climbed into it, and launched himself off. And he flew, according to the writer who was writing about a generation later, he flew a distance that's roughly about 2 football fields. So it worked. Yeah. Then he crashed into an oak tree and broke both his legs.
But that's totally worth it for the story, though.
Yeah.
Why do you not hear about him instead? You you go with Da Vinci?
Yeah. Well, because everyone knows that the Middle Ages was a dark age, Steve. So everyone knows that, right? So as a result, you don't get these stories. You don't hear about Robert Goss test coming up with an idea of an expanding universe in the 13th century. You don't hear about William of Conches coming up with an idea of biological evolution in the 12th century. But you do hear about Leonardo da Vinci, who drew a picture of a flying machine that would never have fucking flown. I mean, it's a beautiful picture.
Yeah, but
he was so ahead of his time.
Yeah, it wouldn't have flown. It had flapping wings. I mean, it was bullshit. It was a fantasy. Whereas Elmer of Malmesbury flew right in the 11th century.
That's crazy. No
one's heard of it.
That's not right though. I mean, why can't you have both? Why can't you acknowledge that it was a compared to the rest of U.S. or not U.S. compared to the rest of the world history, it was a kind of a shitty time, but there were still good things that came out of that particular time period.
Well, look, it was about as shitty as any period before the modern world was shitty. I mean, the Roman period was pretty shitty as well. If you weren't an emperor or one of the rich people, you didn't have central heating, and you didn't live in a marble palace. You lived in a shithole. And if you lived in the 18th century, if you weren't rich, things were pretty shitty. So the medieval period was about as shitty as any other period of human history, and a bit less shitty than most.
I have speaking of shitty, I have a question. Why did we lose track at some point of the flushing toilets thing from that time period? Because my grandmother used to tell stories about how they had to go outside in the back, to those outhouses with a little moon cut out. Where did we lose that?
Well, we didn't really. Most people didn't have the opportunity to build enormous complexes of stone with dams and channels and canals and so on, which is what the monks had. Most people in the Middle Ages didn't have flushing toilets. The rich did, like everywhere. But in the most of the medieval period, they pretty much did what your grandmother did, and that was they dug a deep hole, and then there was some poor bastard who had to come and dig it out. That was kind of how it worked. I would
never survive back then, Tim. I would never survive back then.
It's not pleasant.
I would make it. I would make it all of a week. Anything past like 1965, I would not fare well at all.
People often ask me, "Would you like to live back then?" And I'd say I wouldn't like to live any time before the invention of penicillin. Thanks.
Or Wi-Fi. I would much rather live in a world with Wi-Fi and no penicillin than a penicillin and no Wi-Fi world.
You won't even use a portable toilet, will you, Kyle?
At least I would die with like knowing what's going on in the world. That would be much better than. Here's penicillin. Now there's some wooden blocks over there you can go play with until.
I think any time before the polio vaccine. No.
Yeah, true.
Just keep that. I don't want. I would never want to see people around being put into iron lungs for the rest of their lives. Screw that.
I'm quite happy when I was born in like 1970, and I don't think I would have liked to been born any earlier than that.
Well, just stop and think. What did people do before you were able to just go? I wonder what the answer to that question is, and pull your phone out and ask it. Like, can you imagine what we would sit around doing with no Wi-Fi, having to have conversation with people, like actual conversation with people?
Why hasn't the average IQ gone up? Why hasn't the average knowledge base gone up? We have instant access to knowledge, and yet I don't see a lot of people becoming much smarter than they would have been if the internet hadn't been invented.
Here's why. You have a question? Hold on one second. Siri, can you answer blah, blah, blah? And they'll do it for you. They have an app now where you can literally write out a math equation in handwriting and hold your phone over top of it, and it will solve it for you right there.
I'd be lazy. Hey, there's a sequel to the story of Elmer, because you remember he crashed into the tree, right? So there he was sitting up in the hospital in the Abbey of Malmesbury Abbey with 2 broken legs, and he was sketching a plan for his Mark II glider, because he figured out that the problem was he didn't have a tail on, and he realised that the swallows he'd been seeing had tails. So he was designing the next model, but the abbot came along and said that he wasn't allowed to throw himself off the roof of the church anymore. So there we are. There's the church suppressing technology.
Those bastards. Do they have a drawing or something of what that original glider looked like?
Unfortunately, no. We've only got just one very, very vague 2 or 3 line description of the whole thing. I actually went to Malmesbury when I was in the UK a few years ago with the intention of going to a pub that was built called the Flying Monk, that was built on the spot where apparently he crash landed. And I wanted to go and have an ale at the Flying Monk, but they knocked the bloody pub down and built a supermarket on it instead.
Oh, so, that is sacrilegious.
I know, terrible.
You know what? There's things like that happen often. I saw a news piece the other day. It's been a couple months ago, but Rosa Parks, her house in Detroit was being sold, and I think for it was like $2,500, I think. But I mean, this is a historic house. It's Rosa Parks' house, and the city was doing nothing to preserve it. They were going to sell it and let whatever happened to it happen to it. But a guy from Germany was like, well, I can't let that happen. So he bought the house and then took it down in pieces, like flat pieces, and stacked them up, crated them over to Germany. And so Rosa Parks' house is now built back up as it was in Berlin.
Really?
Yes, in Berlin. It is standing in Berlin as it was in Detroit.
Well, the Flying Monk pub, I don't think was any kind of ancient institution. I think it was just a pub that someone built in the 1920s and thought it'd be funny to name after Elmer. But it would have been nice to have a beer there anyway.
Absolutely, that's a good name for a place.
Just thinking about technology in the Middle Ages again. I mean, Steve, you wear glasses. I wear them occasionally. Anyone who wears glasses, I don't know about you, Steve, but how would you be if you didn't have eyeglasses?
We'd be blind back then. We'd pretty much be useless.
Yeah, and you think about the number of highly intelligent people who have contributed enormous amounts to science and the arts, who again would be completely useless without glasses. Well, glasses, again, we can thank the medieval church for glasses, because they were fascinated by light. They had a great sort of theological interest in light. As a result, when all that Arabic knowledge started coming in via Spain and Sicily in the 12th century, several of the books that they really liked were books on optics. These were expansions of ancient Greek books on optics, and the Arabs had kind of advanced the science of optics. Medieval scientists then began to advance it even more. There was a big debate about how the eye actually saw things. They thought maybe what was going on was that rays were being projected from things into our eyes, or maybe rays were coming out of our eyes and were hitting things. They weren't quite sure what was going on. So what they did was they dissected eyes. They saw that there was a lens in there. They started playing with lenses. And in the course of playing with lenses, someone must have sort of gone, well, hang on, this book that I'm having difficulty reading, I can now sort of see a bit easier when I do this.
Oh, no.
And they invented glasses. Now, we don't know who did it, but we do know from around about the 13th century onwards, they became quite common. And it's really amusing to see sort of some medieval art of, say, the 12 disciples. And because the disciples are meant to be sort of very learned and wise guys, they're all wearing glasses. It's kind of funny.
That, I did not... I think I've seen, actually, now that you say that, I have seen a painting with that in it, and I always wondered, because I was under the impression that you didn't have glasses until fairly recently.
No, it's the 13th century, from about the late 12th.
Yeah, wasn't there pictures of people with monocles and spectacles and things of that nature back in the 13th century or so?
Yep, that's where we first start to see it. Yeah,
I thought Mr. Peanut was the first person to wear a monocle.
We're going to ignore that.
That fell flat, didn't it? Okay.
Still on technology, the fact that we're sitting here talking about this over a computer, you can make an argument that these computers are actually descendants of a medieval invention, and that was the clock, which sounds weird to us, but basically all of the machines of calculation and measurement that we have ultimately can be traced back to clocks that were invented in the late 13th, probably early 14th centuries. We've got a description in a chronicle in the 13th century where this guy is saying some monks are trying to work out how to build a machine that's driven by weights with a kind of a gear race so that the face turns once an hour. So he's describing a clock. But what he's saying is that this was a technical problem that these guys were trying to solve, and we don't know who solved it. But what we do know is from about the 14th century, clocks start to appear. They start off huge, they're like mainframe computers, but in around about the same period that it took for mainframes to go down to desktops, they went from huge down to something that you can actually sit on your table. Now, we don't think of clocks as being incredibly complicated, but just think of two things. Before clocks, you had other machines. You had water clocks, you had candle clocks, but they weren't very reliable. Water clocks froze in winter, and water clocks were also quite tricky things to maintain. Whereas a mechanical clock, you wind it once a day and you leave it. So this actually revolutionized timekeeping. It also meant that we could commoditize time. The monks invented it, but merchants were the ones who really propagated them and started building large ones and putting them up on towers all around the towns of Europe, because that way they could actually charge by the hour, which is something that you couldn't do before. So time became a commodity, literally a commodity that you could charge money for. The other thing about clocks is once people worked out, okay, you can mechanize an hour hand moving around, they also worked out where you can mechanize other stuff as well, other calculations. And so they started building machines that we still refer to as clocks or astronomical clocks, but they were incredibly complex. So I know you like the Antikythera mechanism, Kyle.
I was about to ask.
Okay, the Antikythera mechanism was a child's toy compared to the astronomical clocks of the late Middle Ages. These things were incredible. There was one that took 8.5 years to run through its full cycle of calculations. It could predict eclipses. It could tell you whether it was high or low tide down in London. This was a clock in a monastery up in St Albans. It could tell you what phase of the moon it was. It had something like 480 different calculations, all automatic, just so long as you wound it every day. That clock was built by a guy called Richard of Wallingford, who was an interesting dude. Another thing you often hear about the so-called Dark Ages is that the church kept everyone ignorant. So the church dominated learning and kept everyone stupid. Well, that's not actually true. The church actually had no reason to keep people stupid, and the main reason most people were illiterate was because they were too busy farming and doing other stuff, fighting wars. So they weren't illiterate because they were being kept that way. They were illiterate because they didn't need to be literate. But what the church did do is they recognised smart people when they saw them. Richard of Wallingford was the son of a blacksmith, so he was a peasant. And we don't know exactly what happened, but some point the prior of the local priory near his little village of Wallingford recognised that young Richard was a smart kid, and so educated him, ended up sending him to Oxford University, where he studied philosophy, but he also studied natural philosophy, so science, particularly astronomy, and then he went on to become the abbot of St Albans Abbey. And while he was there, he built this incredible clock. A few years ago, they built a reproduction of this clock, so I've been to see it, and it's amazing. It's just the most incredible. It was literally the most complicated machine any human being had ever built up to that point, and remained one of the most complicated machines for several centuries afterwards. Again, this is the Dark Ages, remember? Does that make sense?
So dark.
Yeah.
Not sounding so dark anymore.
You mentioned before about hygiene, so the toilet situation. One of the other myths about the Dark Ages, the myth about the medieval period, is that no one washed. So we all know the Greeks and Romans loved baths, and the Romans had enormous public baths. Every children's book has a picture of these public baths. But then there's this idea that was all forgotten in the Middle Ages. Again, the church gets blamed. Apparently the church said that being clean was sinful or something, and so people stopped washing. Complete crap. Again, this is something that happened after the Middle Ages but gets projected back. For some reason, for various reasons, in the 17th century, the idea arose that bathing too regularly was bad for your health. And so rich people in particular stopped washing on a regular basis. That was for a fairly brief period from about the 17th into the 18th century. But this gets projected back onto the Middle Ages. Actually, in the Middle Ages, people washed every day. They didn't have hot running water, but what they did have was the ability to heat up some water, put it in a jug, they called it a ewer, pour it into a bowl, and you washed that way. My grandparents washed that way. My grandfather was a coal miner. He washed that way every day. And there's no way my grandmother would have let him in even near the dining table if he hadn't washed himself before he came to dinner. So that's how most people worked. But baths were actually very popular in the Middle Ages. There were public baths. There were public baths in every town. London, medieval London, had about several dozen of them, mainly on the south bank of the Thames. They were called stews in London, which is where we get the word stew from, soaking in hot water. And they were kind of fun places to go. You go there with your friends. People used to bathe together. Men bathed with women, mainly prostitutes, but, you know.
They still are fun, so I hear.
Yeah, I've heard that too. And we've got these illustrations, these illuminations of people sitting around in the bath with their friends, with the prostitutes, with jugs of wine and food, and they're all wearing their hats, which I think is great. They're naked otherwise. So there were plenty of baths, plenty of bathhouses. In medieval Paris, there was a whole guild of bathhouse keepers, and you had various types of bathhouse. So you had the less respectable ones with the prostitutes, but you also had ones that was purely for noble people. You had ones which were purely for women. You had others which were associated with mineral springs, which were mainly for health treatments. People in the Middle Ages did wash, which probably brings us to plague. Have you heard of plague being associated with the Dark Ages and the medieval period?
Oh, sure.
And Moses, he was or Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a plague junkie too.
Yeah, those plagues. Yeah. Well, the one that most people associate with the Middle Ages is the Black Death, which was a pandemic of various forms of plague. It was actually 3 forms of plague: bubonic plague, septicemic plague, and pneumonic plague. The differences being how the bacillus spread, and some forms of plague were more deadly than others. You don't want to get pneumonic plague; you will die, and very quickly. So people associate plague with the medieval period, and it's true that in the 1340s, a major pandemic of bubonic plague hit Europe and killed somewhere around about half the population of Europe. Possibly more. In some places, it was far more. In other places, it literally wiped out whole towns. It was the biggest and worst epidemic, one of the biggest in the world, and certainly the biggest to hit Europe before the influenza epidemic of 1918. So people associate the medieval period with plague. The point is, the reason the plague of the 1340s was so deadly was that plague hadn't hit medieval Europe for hundreds of years. Remember, I mentioned that population had dropped after the fall of the Roman Empire because of a major plague in the 6th century. That was the last time a major epidemic had hit Europe. So the medieval period was not ready for plague. There was no immunity because it hadn't been touched by plague for centuries. And then when it hit in the 1340s, it hit hard. Then it revisited over and over and over again. There was another epidemic in the 1360s. It was called the young dying, because most of the people who died were people in their 20s and teens, because they'd been born since the first visitation. And then it kept popping up again and again right into the 17th century. One of the myths that you hear associated with the plague is that the reason the plague was so bad in Europe was the church, here they are again, told everyone that cats were animals of the devil and that they had to kill cats. So the story goes that there was this massive massacre of cats across medieval Europe because the Pope declared the cats to be diabolical. And as a result, numbers of rats vastly increased. Rats have fleas spread the plague, and that's why the plague happens. It's all due to the Catholic Church. So if you guys, have you heard that one?
No wonder cats are so angry these days. It makes sense.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to imagine that, because I'm the one of those people that even during that Sarah McLachlan commercial where she's talking about donating to the the ASPCA, and it shows those sad little animals and stuff, I have to turn the channel and I flip out until I'm able to get the remote and change it. I can't take it.
Well, that would make sense, though. I mean, if they kill the cats normally would be killing the rats and the mice population. They're the ones that have the ticks or the fleas that were causing the Black Death.
Yeah.
That makes sense as a causal relationship.
The Pied Piper
right?
would have taken care of the rats. He just comes through the city and blows that little flute, and the rats follow him out.
The story makes sense. The only problem with it is that the massacre of cats never happened.
Oh, thank God.
So there you go. It's okay, Carl.
Cats are safe.
Yeah. In fact, medieval people kind of like cats. I've got an article on this on my blog where Carl, you can go and have a look, because there's lots of medieval pictures of cats in my article.
I'll have to do that. But this does raise another serious question, and that is that means that cats are pissed off all the time for no reason.
Yeah, the cats are just arseholes. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
You know that cats are the reason that the Earth is the number one proof that the Earth is not flat, right? Because if it was flat, the cats would have pushed everything off the edge by now.
That's a good one, man.
Thank you. It's not mine.
The other reason that people talk about this non-existent massacre of cats, they say that the church blamed associated cats with witches, and the other thing that you always hear about in association with the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages is the burning of witches. Witches were being burned left, right, and centre throughout the medieval period, and in any Hollywood depiction of the medieval period, you usually see some ugly priest who's usually threatening, usually some good-looking female, with the idea of being burnt as a witch. And this is a very common idea about the medieval period. Unfortunately, again, or maybe fortunately, it's bullshit. The church's teaching on witches and witchcraft for almost all of the medieval period was that they didn't exist, and that if you actually accuse someone of witchcraft, you were committing a sin and should be punished. So there's a law from the 9th century which says, "Let nobody presume to kill a foreign serving maid or female servant as a witch, for it is not possible, nor ought it be believed by any Christian mind." This is just one of about a dozen laws that said witches don't exist. That was the church's teaching. There's even one story about a guy from most of the medieval period.
Well, wait, then why would the Bible say thou shalt not suffer a witch to live?
Yeah, they go stupid.
Okay, it doesn't, Steve, because the Bible wasn't written in English. What happened was a word for a seeress or a visionary in Hebrew was translated as witch in the King James Version.
One that does divination.
That's right. I knew it. I knew that was coming.
Is that what it was? Somebody who does type of divination of some sort?
That's exactly right. Someone. It was pythone is the Latin word for it. It's someone who communes with the dead. Mm-hmm. I can't remember the Hebrew word, but it got translated as witch in the King James Version because King James was obsessed with witchcraft. This whole witch thing arose right at the end of the medieval period, and the witch craze was not during the medieval period. It was during the what we call the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. If for some reason you don't ever hear about the witch craze of the Enlightenment. So the whole witch thing
was the word ash shap or something? It meant conjurer or necromancer.
Rings a bell.
We had a guy, Jerry Griffith, was on here last Monday and went through the story of how the KJV version of the Bible came to be, and that's actually where he started, was talking about the whole witch thing, where he blamed the shipwreck of his bride that he was going to marry on witches. So
he was obsessed with
it. King James fucked it up for everybody. I mean, all around.
He wasn't a great guy.
No.
The whole witch thing developed after the Black Death. So around about the time of the Black Death, can you imagine having 50% of the population dying in the space of about a year? If you imagine everyone 50% of them dead within a year, had a massive psychological impact on.
I'd be okay with that, I think.
People of Europe. Depends on the people. True. Unfortunately, you don't get to pick.
Oh, okay. Damn it.
So what happened was people started to try and come up with explanations as to how this could happen, and they started to come up with conspiracy theories, which were very much the case back then, about Jews poisoning wells, about foreigners, gypsies, and so on coming in from outside and bringing disease with them. And one of them was this idea that there was this sort of secret society of women who worshipped Satan and who were potentially spreading the plague. So this idea of persecuting a secret society of people who were trying to bring about the fall of civilization began to take hold in the late 14th century. And then that kind of came together with this folk belief in witches. And eventually in 1484, so right at the end of the Middle Ages, the Pope said, there are these things called witches. We were wrong about that before, and now we can start massacring witches. So that's where the witch craze started. But it was right at the end of the Middle Ages, and that's why the witch craze was in the centuries afterwards.
So much for that whole infallible thing.
Yeah, that really doesn't work, does it? Yeah.
Not considering that every pope comes out and apologizes for something. And
yeah, we were wrong about that.
Yeah, don't pay any attention. Nothing. It's nothing.
Yeah. So I suppose I've tried to. I've moved pretty quickly over a whole lot of stuff, and I could actually. I mean, there's basically at least a blog article in most of the things I've touched on. I'm going to be tackling quite a few of them over the next few months. But I suppose my point is, there's a lot of cliches and a lot of mistaken ideas about this period of history, and as a result, people take a lot of those ideas and mix them together with their attitude towards Christianity, and they sort of say, well, if here's an idea that is very common about the medieval period, it seems to be connected to this idea that the church was evil and were a pack of arseholes. I'll put them together and believe them. And the problem is most of these ideas about the medieval period are wrong. And again, my mantra. The real history is much more interesting. What I would say, maybe just to sort of finish up, is yet again, God still doesn't exist. Jesus still wasn't God. Christianity is still crap. Most Christians are fuckwits. All that's true. But all I'm saying is, if you're going to use history against Christianity, you've got to do your homework. So don't say that the church caused cat massacres and that caused the Black Death, because that's bullshit. Don't say there was no science in the Middle Ages, because that's wrong. Don't say they suppressed technology, because they didn't. They spread it. Don't say they destroyed ancient Greek learning, because if you can read any ancient Greek stuff, you've got a whole lot of Christian monks to thank for it.
Well, let me ask you, if somebody wanted to do independent research, like example, I'm not a scholar, but let's say like the cat thing, which I've heard before. Obviously, that's a narrative that's been around for a very long while. That killing of the cats produced the fact that more rodents were around, more rodents, more fleas, Black Death. Where would we go to actually determine which one is a better argument? Which one is the way the history was done? How would like a layperson like myself go about validating, saying, okay, Tim says this, other people say this. I want to know the truth.
Okay, so that's a really good question, Stephen. I think you picked a very good example to illustrate this. The core question you always need to ask is, how do we know? And this is what I do when I come across people who make that claim about the cat massacre. I say, show me the source that talks about this massacre of cats. Show me the edict by the Pope saying, go kill cats. Show me any references to lots of people killing cats. And I'm always met with silence, because there aren't any. So
this is like one of those 3 men and a tiger type tales. It just gets put forth, but there's no real substance to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It just gets repeated. Every time I come across this, I say, give me a source, and they simply give me a modern source that repeats the myth. And I say,
I find that happens quite frequently. I ask for citations for a lot of things, and I got to tell you, a lot of people who put forth certain things, when I ask them for a citation, none are forthcoming, or it's just like a blog or a general type of a form rather than an actual, what I consider to be what it be something you would actually cite. If you're writing a peer review paper, you don't cite a blog, right? You need to cite an academic source. And yet when I ask for a citation, people give me very general colloquial type things, and I'm like, these are not what I consider to be citations or formal academic sources. I'll take peer review papers. I'll take even a high-level college textbook. I would even accept in some cases. But in these kind of things, I think that would be. They would need to actually probably find some kind of historical record that has been that says something along those lines that we went out today and killed a bunch of cats, right?
Yeah. So, and think about everything that I've said today. I mean, I've been making some very broad generalizations because I'm skating over an entire 1,000-year period of history. Yeah. But every now and then I would stop and say, we know this because, and I would refer to people and I would refer to writings. That's what history is based on. It's based on evidence. So you can't just say they killed lots of cats and then just say, I don't need to back that up. Yes, you fucking do. If you're going to make that claim, then show me the evidence. Now, it could be that I and every historian of the medieval period has completely missed the evidence, but I don't think so.
So I think that at this point, what we're going to do for the next time you're on is I'm going to have a graphic put up, and the first thing that will come up is Christians burnt the Library of Alexandria, and fuck off. Christians caused the Dark Ages. Fuck off. So what are we telling to fuck off next, Tim?
Don't know. I think you guys were keen on us doing one on the Jesus myth idea.
Okay, so we're telling Jesus to fuck off. Is that right? Is that appropriate?
Well, we can if we want to. I was thinking more of telling the mythicists to fuck off.
Okay, all right. So yeah, we can we'll add that to the list next. At some point, I do want to, because I see it on your blog every time I go there to get your bio, but I see the flat Earth, the flat Earth one. That would be an interesting point to do too.
Sure. Yeah, might not be a whole show for that one, but yeah, I'll see what I can think of.
Excellent. All right. Well, that was awesome, as always. Tim, you are one of our favorite people to bring on the show. The Absolutely. People love you. We love you, and we get all kind of information. I know that I'm just a snarky,
No, I like your stuff, Carl. Yeah, I like your stuff. It's good.
That's how I get my thing in. But thank you, Tim, for and again, this is another one of those examples of you lose track of time, because we actually set a record this past Monday at 2 hours and 2 minutes, I believe it was, with Jerry for the longest running show that we did. And actually tonight you beat Jerry by 15 minutes. So okay. This is now the longest episode that we have done. So congrats, Tim.
Great.
Steve is not clapping. He's not celebrating.
Yay. Actually, I don't think this is the longest. No, I don't. I think Jerry's went longer. This is a close second, but I would have to do the time.
No, I just looked at it.
Is it?
We did have a lot of fucking around at the beginning.
Yeah, we had some technical differences to go, so it might be a caveat on that. So
yeah.
Well, we'll tell that to fuck off too. We'll add that to Tim's fuck off list.
I like that. It's good slogan.
Tim's got a huge fuck off list.
Well, we want to say thanks to him once again. Check out his blog. It's historyforatheists.com. All kind of good information like you heard tonight, and much more. There's several different pieces on there that make up that blog that I think that everybody can get something out of. And what I always say when he's on is, whether you're an atheist or a Christian, whether you think that an argument's good or bad, doesn't matter. You always want to be arguing with the correct information. Otherwise, the other side is going to make you look like a bitch. So in order to not look like a bitch, brush up on your facts. Did you want to say something else, Tim?
Don't look like a bitch. Hashtag bitch made.
Just wondering if there's any questions anyone had from the live chat.
No, we've got to wrap this up. We are.
Okay. I'm filming the episode for our show tomorrow at 10:15. So I've got to jump from here over to that to record that for tomorrow. And that's at 7:00, guys. Remember, tomorrow it's at Homies at 7 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. But I will say this, Tim, if you do have questions for Tim, sorry that we couldn't get to them tonight. I'm just have to switch over to that other recording. But if you'll leave them in the comment section, I know, Tim, you're there. You check that out pretty regularly after we do an episode, right?
Yeah, always happy to engage.
Yeah. So he leave those there, and when he has time, maybe he can check those and answer that way, or just hold them, and he'll be back on in a few weeks, like he always is. So
Tim is definitely not known. Hashtag bitch me, that's for sure.
That's exactly right.
Definitely not.
Well, hashtag fuck off.
Exactly.
Nice. All right, guys. We'll see you. Actually, we'll see you live again next Monday at 8 p.m. for the Issues with Islam. But join us tomorrow. The At Homies debut will be at 7 p.m. on this channel, as well as Mr. Atheist channel. And you can check out the videos that we tackle. Also, Steve will be on the Atheist Edge at 10 Central. Steve?
10
he ain't pay attention. Just look for Steve on YouTube at some point tomorrow, and you'll be able to find it.
You know what's so funny is our schedules have been going crazy lately. We have like 3 scheduled things that we have to combine, because I've got mine, Kyle has his, we have ours, we have Dave's, we have all these other things that we're doing. So it's pretty crazy anymore.
Are you not entertained?
Cool.
And with that, America, we bid you an okay night.
Good night.
No.
Non-sequitur. Your facts are
awesome. Tim, awesome job as always. I'm sorry that I have to rush off.
No, that's cool, man.
Or
No worries.
Yeah, I gotta admit, I really do enjoy these conversations. I just feel a little out of place because I got an area that I